All right, happy Friday. So we are now in Module 9, getting towards the end of the semester. We are going to tackle grid today. I'm going to turn up the light so you guys can see that a little bit better. There we go. So we're going to talk about grid. Just a quick show of hands, who has worked with grid before? I know some of you have, a lot of you have. So that's good. So you're familiar with grid. So I'm going to go through the basics today, and then I'm going to let you do some independent learning where you get to tackle some of the harder grid concepts. So this is what we are going to work through, starting off with some cool stuff. We're going to go through your midterm exam. Those are all marked, so you should have your grade for that unless you did a makeup and then not quite yet. Grid basics, then you're going to do some independent learning. And then we're going to talk about Lab 3 and Assignment 2. So just a quick look on Blackboard. Remember that the best way to stay up to date with your assignments is to jump on the calendar. Here we are. So I'm going to warn you, it's a little bit heavy for the next couple weeks. Lab 3 is going to be due tonight at 11:59. Don't worry, it's actually, you're going to have a chance hopefully to do it in class. The next assignment, so assignment 2 is coming up next week. That's going to be due at the end of the day. I'll introduce that by the end of today's class. We're going to have lab 4 coming up after that, and then assignment 3, and then after that, whoops, there we go. The only other thing is your final project. So just a reminder, and maybe you like this fact, maybe not, but there is no final exam. It's just your final project. So that will sort of culminate all the things that we've talked about throughout the semester. So you don't have to worry about studying, but you do have to worry about that final project. And we'll talk about that soon so that you have lots of time to do a great job on that. Okay, so let's go back, and I have some cool stuff to share with you. This class is fun. I'm always able to find lots of neat things. So first up, this is 18 cool things you won't believe were built using CSS. So I think I showed you The Simpsons with CSS, which is pretty amazing. If not, take a look at that. It's pure CSS, and it's pretty great. Minions. Yeah, Minions with pure CSS if you're a Minions fan. There is text shadow, so this neon sign made with CSS3. You can make a block of cheese with CSS. I kind of want to look at that. Let's take a look. Or sponge, whatever you want to think of it as, but that's pretty cool. And again, just kind of amazing to look at the CSS. You guys have worked with CSS enough to know that that would be pretty hard to create with just CSS. No JavaScript going on, nothing else. It's not an image, it's just CSS. All right, so there's a bunch of other cool stuff. Check that out. The next one is sort of similar but different. This is cool things you might not know about CSS. So maybe you've probably seen this, the CSS is awesome meme. Maybe you've played around with filters and gradients. If not, they're pretty cool, so check that out. CSS units, so moving beyond pixels, so going to percentage, M, rem, all that good stuff. Viewport units, so viewport height and so on. There is an alternative unit for rotate. So these are all things that you might not have come across yet, but they're definitely helpful to know. So check that out for sure. Shorthand properties, I'm sure you know those, but that definitely saves you some time and compresses your code a little, which is always a good thing. And that is cool. And there's some references there as well that are also, I'm sure, pretty great. Back to the CSS cheese. All right. Okay, so like I said, we're talking about grid today. So this one is pretty cool. This is grid by example. So it's everything, apparently, everything you need to know about CSS grid layout. When I first landed on this page, I kind of thought, ooh, what is this? It doesn't look great, but it's pretty cool. So it does go through the topics sort of in a very granular way. So starting with defining a grid, line-based placement, and it has an example for each. So it's a really robust sort of source for understanding grid with examples. So it might not be the prettiest website you've ever seen, but it's definitely a good resource. There's also a video tutorial, a getting started, so some resources there, but pretty cool stuff if you really want to get to know grid really well. Okay, so I've got quite a few of these. This is an ultimate collection of CSS grid resources. So again, just helping you to learn more about grid. This is pretty cool. They built this famous piece of art using CSS grid, and it kind of lends itself well to grid for sure. So check that out. There's some references. There's also Can I Use? I'm not sure if you guys know about this, but this is checking different things and seeing the support across different browsers. So Grid, for the most part, is pretty well supported now, but that didn't always used to be the case. Same with Flexbox. So when they first sort of came up with Flexbox and Grid, this support was not as good, but as you can see, it looks pretty good now, which is great, meaning we can use it without using vendor prefixes. So that's good for us. All right, so that's a bunch of CSS Grid resources. There's also Learn CSS Grid, so another resource site for you. Again, goes through everything in lots of detail. Talks about this whole explicit grid thing, which can be a little difficult to understand sometimes. So reading that would probably help you out. Naming grid lines, talks about the implicit grid. Aligning grid tracks, all that good stuff. And if you're a visual learner, it does give you images as well. So sometimes just reading, especially when we're talking about coding, when you're just reading something, it can be hard to kind of see how it works. But when you see an image and as well beside the code, so seeing the code and what it produces, that can be pretty helpful. So I would definitely take a look at that one as well. Okay, CSS Grid Garden. That one's just a game. I couldn't figure out how to play it. So if you can figure out how to play it, let me know. But it is sort of a gamified way to learn grid. So I'm sure I was just kind of missing, I'm not very good at games, so anyway, I think I was just missing the instructions, but it is supposed to be a way that you can sort of play this game and move up different levels while still practicing your grid skills. So check that out too. And then if you figure it out, let me know how to play. Like I said, lots of resources. So this one is a cat loader, just kind of for fun. If you want to put it on your project website, might be bonus marks, I don't know. Grid cats. So this, I don't actually remember what this is. I think it's working with grid, but it might just be cats. I don't know. So we can look at the code and see, but it had cats and grids, so it was all good. So let's take a look. Can I check it out? Maybe later. Anyway, check that out too. CSS snippets for animal lovers. So I'm moving beyond cats being a little more inclusive, except there's the cat loader as well, but there's some dog CSS, teddy bear, dog and ball. So again, these are all things that you can create with CSS. So pretty cool stuff. Check that out too, or even try and create your own. And where are we? Two more things. Let's skip that last one because it's not hooked up. But this is interesting. So we talk about all the things that CSS can do. So this is a recent article, November 1st, 2019. But this is talking about the things that CSS can't do yet. So it's kind of interesting to see. We've come really far with CSS, as you guys know, but there's still things that we just can't quite do. So overflow in the block dimension for multi-call. So these are pretty complex. Spanning n number of columns. So a lot of this has to do with floats. Floats are still just not great. They haven't really gotten any better. Disconnected text flows. So again, I'm sure that would involve floats too. CSS region specification, so showing there's that can I use site again. Support for this, not so great. So again, you know, a year from now, maybe even less, we'll probably see that all green. So that's how CSS works. Something new comes out, it's not well supported, so you have to plan for that by using things like fallbacks and browser prefixes. And then, you know, within a year or even less, then it's supported and you're good to go. All right, so that is cool things for today. Let's talk, we talk about why grid is rad, we are going to talk about your midterm. So taking a quick look at that, I'm just going to go over the questions. I'll try and make that relatively quick. So I will make it available to you as well so you can take a look. All right, so you guys did well. Hopefully it was a good test, not too tricky, but still challenged you enough. So the first question, this might not have been your first question, but the first question that I made was, when using Flexbox, which style rule will produce the following visual result based on this code? So you've got this, and the right answer was box. So we have a class that we can work with of box, display flex, and flex direction column reverse. So we see that it is displayed in a column structure. They are stacked one on top of each other, and instead of our source code has 1, 2, 3, but we've used reverse. So it'll be the opposite in our page when it's rendered. So the right answer is the first one there. So of course I tried to trick you a little bit, but I'm sure I didn't. So the other ones were column but not reverse, row reverse, but it's actually displaying in columns, and then flex direction row. All right, Bootstrap and the design patterns that are easy to implement. So 3 design patterns. So some of you, I think the word pattern threw some of you off. You were thinking layout patterns. And I get it, why you kind of went that direction. But I was looking for design patterns. So we did talk about design patterns and why we use them, because users are used to them. They're quite able to do certain things. So when I'm talking about design patterns, who can give me one example of a design pattern? We also looked in depth at quite a few. So do you want to give me one?
I don't know, but are you talking about like the app layout?
I am not.
So that,
yeah.
I didn't even put that on my midterm. Something else. So
okay, well maybe you put the right thing. So,
no.
So that would be a layout pattern. So close. When I'm talking about design patterns, I'm talking about things like carousels, popovers, accordions. So you got it right. Okay, there you go. Good. Yeah. So we did talk about design patterns, these common sort of UI elements, and we looked at several in depth. So we looked at carousels, we looked at popovers, accordions, that kind of thing. So I was looking for 3 of those. Okay, so if you did give me some layout patterns, I get where you were going, but not quite. And we did use the term design patterns in one of our lectures. So. All right, so when using Flexbox, an area of a document laid out using Flexbox is called the Flex container. That's true. Using appropriate ARIA roles can help make Bootstrap interactive components accessible to those using a screen reader device. Yes. So by default, some of these interactive components are not super accessible. So we need to do the work to add those ARIA roles that will help people using a screen reader. Containers are not required when using Bootstrap default grid system. This one got a few of you as well. So required, if you look at the Bootstrap documentation, it does say that they are required. Although, if you run your code and you don't put a container, an element with the class of container, it'll still technically work. It'll display on the screen. It's just not technically right. So I'm going with the Bootstrap documentation, which clearly says containers are required. So that's why that is false. Okay, moving on. So what is happening in the following code? So I did want you to get pretty in-depth here, give me some detail. So first of all, you could say that there is sort of a wrapper div, or no, sorry, a row created with the class of featurette. Within that row, there's two columns. One is 7, one's 5, adding up to 12. This is only on a medium viewport or larger. So again, giving me lots of detail here, and then also telling me what this order thing does. So this changes the order based on the viewport size. So that's what I was looking for there. So some of you might have said, oh, creating two columns, that's good. You would have got part marks for that, but go a little bit further. Tell me how big those columns are. Tell me about the order thing, and tell me what this row is doing as well. All right, Bootstrap is developed to be mobile first. That is true. When it comes to usability, navigation items are not really that important. That is false. You might have noticed that that, I think, was marked incorrectly when you first finished your exam. So that was came up as true. So if you put false, you would have got it wrong. I fixed that, so you got the mark. So that should be good now. So layout choices, so there were 5 in total. If you chose 3 but you missed a couple, you would have got 3 marks. I think I went through and fixed those if you didn't get them initially. But the layout choices are F pattern, Z pattern, grid layout, full screen, and featured layout. All right, regardless of the source order of Flex children, you can control the sequence of how they are arranged. Again, trying to trick you. It's order, it's not flex order. Order is the right answer. It's not align self or flex basis. So first one is the right one. In order to ensure that browsers render all elements more consistently and in line with modern standards, HTML5 boilerplate uses which of the following CSS files? So you could have taken a look, opened up your boilerplate code from the first week, but it is normalized CSS that's used to do that. For the Bootstrap grid question, the correct answer was call MD6. So again, small difference here, trying to trick you. You got to be careful there. It's definitely not call MD 50%. This is the right answer. Carousels are naturally compliant with all accessibility standards. That is false. So we have to make sure that we are making those as accessible as possible. What Bootstrap class would you add? Active. The attribute we would use is data target. Data interval helps us to change the timing. Modular approach. Why is it a good idea? So I was looking for 3 pretty good reasons why it's a good idea to use a modular approach. First of all, what do I mean by a modular approach to CSS? Yeah.
Instead of having all your styles on one style sheet, breaking it into separate style sheets, categorized based on something like a theme, like typography or navigation.
Yeah, whatever makes sense. Yeah, that's exactly right. So why do we do that? And I'm actually noticing some of you are doing this in your projects, and it makes me super happy. So good job, because I didn't even ask you to do that, so I love it. But why is it a good idea in most cases, or a large amount of cases? How does it help? Go for it.
You need to make changes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you need to change the font size on H1.
Yep.
You only have to change it in one style sheet to affect the whole site.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's rooting through every time, every instance of H1 in the main style sheet, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So it helps to reduce repetition. It makes updating things way easier. You know exactly where it's going to be. You don't have to search for it in one big CSS file. And then also, if you're working as a team, it makes sort of breaking down the tasks easier because, hey, you can deal with the topography, you can deal with layout, that kind of thing. So it's a good idea for those reasons. It doesn't always work for every project, but for many projects, it is a good approach. So that would be the 3 I'm looking for there. Effective navigation. This came straight from your slides. Who can give me a couple reasons, or sorry, not reasons, ways we can create effective navigation? Yeah.
So you could select the logo of your site serves a home button.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
Also include some, just to make it like really obvious. The navigation elements are important to make them stand out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's two really good ones. So using your logo as a way to get home, that's pretty typical on sites. Making it obvious that it's navigation. Using language that makes sense. Making it mobile responsive. Forget what else. There's got to be one other. Does anyone have the one I'm forgetting? Effective navigation. It'll come to me. But there was one other thing. I'm pretty sure what I was looking for. But anyway, you had to have 5 good ways to make your navigation effective. So we did talk about those in class. They were right from your lecture notes. Adopt the philosophy that less is more. Plan and choose the menu order strategically. So anything like that, familiar structure and user-friendly language, making it stand out. Anything like that, that's what I was looking for there. Floats are bad. That is false. We can use Flexbox utilities when working with Bootstrap. Yes, so Bootstrap 4 now incorporates those Flexbox utilities. You should always organize your CSS styles by page. No, we talked about that. That would be a bad idea. You'd be duplicating a lot of your styles, so it doesn't really make sense to break it up that way. No link between a website layout and user engagement. That's false. Goals could affect the layout you choose. True. Bootstrap, how does it help us to develop a site rapidly? So what I was looking for here is basically you saying that yes, it does allow you to develop a site rapidly, and then 3 reasons why Bootstrap is the way to go if you want to create a site really quickly. So who can give me one reason why we use Bootstrap? What is the point? Why do we do it? Anybody? Go for it.
It's predefined components that you can implement really quickly.
Yeah.
Got a lot of code.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't have to build those from the ground up. They are there for us. We just need to include the right code that includes those elements. What else do we like about the Bootstrap? Yeah. Yeah, so that's the other 2 actually. So it has a nice grid system we can work with, and it's also responsive. So we don't have to worry about that either, which is awesome. So Bootstrap, only CSS framework available. Nope, we looked at quite a few. There are tons of random ones that you've never even heard of. So it's not the only one, but it is one of the most popular ones. So this one, pick the appropriate Bootstrap grid HTML from the list below. So it was the second answer here, would create this layout on a small, medium, and large device. This one was a bit messy. I had to put the different code there. So originally you had that, but that is not involved in this question, so just ignore that. We're looking at this code, what type of navigation is being created. I think it's pretty obvious because it uses the word dropdown, so that's the right one there. When using Flexbox to position all the items toward the start of the flex direction, we use justify content flex start. That's the property and value we need to work with. When using Flexbox, this property defines the ability for a flex item to grow if necessary, and that's probably pretty evident as well, flex grow. And then lastly, when using Flexbox, adding the flex direction property to the flex container allows us to change the direction in which our flex items display, and that is true. Okay, so if you did lose a few marks, particularly for those short answer questions, it's kind of what I'm looking for. But if you do have any questions, any further questions, probably an email would be best, or talk with me on the break, and I will get back to you as soon as I can about that. Moving on to new stuff, let's talk about why Grid is rad. So you guys have already used Grid. Grid is new for me. I actually kind of used Flexbox mostly before, so I had some fun kind of getting used to Grid. And this is why it's pretty cool. So unlike Flexbox, it is two-dimensional, so we're working with rows and columns. It can be used in conjunction with Flexbox, so that's pretty cool. It's not sort of an all or nothing thing. And there is good support, so we don't have to worry about browser prefixes or fallbacks or anything like that. And it's pretty powerful. So we looked at we looked at Flexbox. We worked with that. Let's take a look at Flexbox versus Grid. So again, like I said, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. We can actually kind of use them together. So I'm going to play this short video for you.
Questions people ask when they first learn about CSS Grid is, hey, does this replace
Actually, I'm going to switch it up because the sound is a little bit better on here. Except there's no sound. Okay, well, we'll just have to... Oh, right, let's switch it. Okay, here we go. Maybe. Nope. Okay, back to this one. So it's a little quiet.
Should I use Grid instead of Flexbox? No, that's not really how things are going to work. So Grid has been invented to do things that Flexbox couldn't do, and Flexbox is still a great tool for us to use to do things that Grid can't do. And we're also going to use a lot of the other parts of CSS that we've used for layout for a long time. Floats, for example, there'll be plenty of times to use a float. And flow, the way...
Okay, I figured out the sound. Switching back. This will happen. It's a good video.
Oh, that's not really how things are going to work.
Let's go back.
The biggest questions people ask when they first learn about CSS Grid is, hey, does this replace Flexbox? Should I use Grid instead of Flexbox? No, that's not really how things are going to work. So Grid has been invented to do things that Flexbox couldn't do, and Flexbox is still a great tool for us to use to do things that Grid can't do. And we're also going to use a lot of the other parts of CSS that we've used for layout for a long time. Floats, for example, there'll be plenty of times to use a float. And flow, the way the web pages get laid out, the way it's always been before CSS actually was invented, the way content flows down the page in a block direction or an inline direction. These are all parts of a larger picture that we'll want to understand and put Grid into that situation. We'll use Grid on certain parts of the page and not on other parts of the page. It's not like the tools that we've been using, say, Bootstrap or Foundation or 960 Grid back in the day. It doesn't handle layout for the whole page. It handles layout for a particular container, one container on the page, and the items that are directly a direct child of that container. So you're going to mix Grid with other things. You'll mix Grid with Flexbox. You'll mix Grid with a basic flow. You'll mix Grid with floats, with other kinds of things. So why do you want to use Flexbox? Why do you want to use CSS Grid? Which one should you use when? Flexbox is really great when you want to line things up in one direction. Maybe you could think of it as a whole bunch of boxes that are in an infinitely long line. Oh, but it's not infinitely long. It's actually a limited amount of space, so it happens to wrap or doesn't wrap. Whether it wraps or not, the calculations that are being made are all happening one line at a time. The browser only ever thinks about things in one dimension at a time. It doesn't have any way to know if you end up with several different rows. It doesn't calculate information across those rows, or if you're going the other direction. It will calculate them in one direction and not in the other direction. Grid has the ability to line things up in two directions, and in fact, Grid always wants to line things up in two directions. You can't get it to kind of stagger things. It thinks about rows and columns at the same time, and it's going to want to make adjustments to your grid based on what's going on in both of those directions at the same time. So here's a diagram of a layout that you would do with grid, where things are actually lining up in both directions. And here's a diagram of how things might work out in Flexbox, where the calculations are being done in each row one at a time with no regard to the other rows. And you can see that those things don't actually line up. Perhaps it's dependent on the size of the content or the size of the amount of stuff that's on the page. Here's a diagram that really kind of shows you what grid is good at and what Flexbox is good at. There are some situations where Flexbox or grid could be used where they basically do the same thing. One thing, though, that grid can do that Flexbox cannot do is intentionally overlap items. So if you're in a situation where maybe either one would work, but you want to overlap items, then that's going to be a situation you definitely want to use grid in. Here's an example where we've got images that are content images, not background images, but images in the content, and I've got a sentence for each one and a little background color on each of those sentences. The sentences are different lengths, so we don't want to use some sort of absolute positioning or something that's not going to work for different amounts of content. We're going to use grid for this, but we're using grid. We could use Flexbox if there's no overlap, but because there's overlap, we want to use grid in this situation. So get to know grid, get to know Flexbox, kind of know what each one is best at, and then use whichever one is best. It depends on which one has the superpowers that you need at that moment.
Cool. So, like I said, that's a good video describing the differences between the two. So it's not one or the other. In some instances, Flexbox makes sense. In some, grid makes sense. Grid is a little more powerful just because we have the addition of rows. Columns and rows. We're not just working in the one sort of dimensional Flexbox lining things up kind of structure. So one more video, same lady, she does a great job talking about grid. So I'm going to play you this one. It's a little bit longer. And I have no sound again. Interesting. No idea. All right, well, had sound. Okay. Okay, so we'll restart that.
Box and grid together to create a layout using the modern tools that we have now. If you go to labs.jensimmons.com, you'll see this example here. I can click and check it out. This is the kind of layout that we do a lot. Teaser cards.
Let me explain to you some of the basics of CSS.
You can see that this is fully responsive. As I make the browser window smaller, everything kind of squishes around. Now this is the kind of layout that we've been trying the last couple of years to do with Flexbox.
Sorry, I'm just going to pause that. There's actually a different video I want to show you that is grid big picture. So let me find that because that will help us to kind of think more about the big picture before we get into the actual code.
Works. CSS Grid, of course, is a. Let me explain to you some of the basics of CSS Grid to give you a kind of overall mental model for how this creature works. CSS Grid, of course, is a brand new set of technologies that let us have a powerful way to do page layout on the web. It comes from this CSS specification, where all CSS comes from, a technical document that many different browser makers collaborated on together in order to make this thing exist. This is the official document that the folks who make browsers refer to in order to figure out what it is that they're supposed to build. And if a browser maker ever has a question or there's some sort of confusion, they go back to the people who are in charge of the specification to change the spec, clarify the spec, make sure the spec is what it's supposed to be. That's why all these different browsers have implementations of CSS Grid that are so well aligned with each other. They're very compatible because everyone's working off this document. And specifications and the way specs work it's just working, that process is working so well now in 2017, better than it ever has before. That's why Grid is coming out of the gate just ready to go. This is the level 1 specification. There's some ideas, and I'll talk about a few of them, about what grid might do in the future. That will be written up in a level 2 specification. So grid level 1 is sort of done, it's baked, it's locked down, that's already what's in browsers. Eventually there'll be more features added to it, but this is what we've got for now. So let's look at this. Here we can imagine content that we've got, or pieces of an interface that we want to lay out in some sort of fashion. Maybe we have this idea in our mind's eye of how these yellow boxes are going to get laid out. We're going to create a grid in CSS in order to do that layout. So there's the grid. Like, you design the grid, you design the columns and the rows, you figure out how they're going to work, and then that gives you places in which to put different parts, different elements, basically, any element in the DOM. That overall box, the box that is the grid, that holds the grid itself, is called a grid container. And then any particular element that's been placed on the grid is considered a grid item. It's called a grid item. Now, grid items have to be direct children of the grid container. So in this example, there's a main element, and inside the main element, we've got a div, some text, another div, some more text, a section, and a footer. It doesn't matter what those items are, but they all have to be direct children of the main. So basically, anything that is a direct child of that main element automatically becomes a grid item. There's no choice. And in fact, those bits of text, this is an anonymous grid item, and hello world, those are actually wrapped in elements. So the browser's going to kind of wrap them in what's called an anonymous element, like a fake, like a kind of pretend element. For us people who make the websites, it sort of like doesn't exist. For the people who make browsers, it very much exists. But kind of what it means is that if you just have extra stuff floating around, the browser is going to put elements around them in order to get everything nice and neat. It's going to want to take each one of those elements and place them on the grid. Another way to do it, or probably a really super common way to do this, is we're going to have an unordered list with a bunch of list items. The unordered list is the grid container, and the list items are the grid items. Or here you can see body, and inside the body is a header, a main, and inside the main there's an article. Inside the article there's an H1, a P, a figure. Also, underneath body, we've got an aside and a footer. Basically what that means is the header, the main, the aside, and the footer are all direct children of this body element. And those are available to be placed on the grid that we define on body. Everything else, like the article, the H1, the P, the figure, those things are grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the grid container. And so they cannot be placed on this particular grid. If we put a grid on body, only the header, the main, the aside, and the footer can be placed on that grid. This is very different than the mental models we've had with the tools we've been using, all the way from 960.js through Foundation up through Bootstrap. Those systems were like you just had one grid. You had one grid and you just applied it to the entire website all at once. This is not like that at all. We're going to be defining multiple grids and using them at different places on the page. And in this case, if I put a grid on the body, I can only place these major elements, these things that are direct children of the body, onto that grid. So what that might mean is we want to define a second grid on the article. So on article, we say display grid, and then we define another grid. And on that article grid, we can place the H1, the Ps, the figure, and have a way to lay that out. Now we might want the things inside the article to be lined up with the things on the main page layout. Maybe we want the aside on the child of the body, the aside that is a child of the body. We might want to line that up with something like the figure in the article. We can't quite do that right now. In the future, with grid level 2, we'll probably have a tool called subgrid that will let us kind of create a grid and pull it down through the layers of generations from the children to the grandchildren and to the great-grandchildren, and then communicate information back up through the family tree. But we don't have subgrid yet. There's several blog posts written about it. There's some work being done to try to ask questions of people what they need, what they want, to make sure that subgrid covers all the use cases that we have. But it doesn't exist yet. It's not in any browser yet. So for all practical purposes, it's not a tool that we can use. What we'll do instead is have nested grids, where we have a grid inside of a grid inside of a grid. So the other thing that we'll be doing, because of the nature of grid and the way that it applies to a container and only affects its direct children, we're going to be using grid alongside of Flexbox. So in this example, I've got an unordered list with a bunch of list items, and on the unordered list, I'm going to say display grid, and then each of the LIs are grid items. But then inside each LI, I've got in each one an image, a paragraph, and I want to lay those out. Now I could make another grid there, but maybe I decide that actually the layout of the content inside the list item could be done perfectly well with Flexbox. So I could put a display flex on that LI. So the LI is both a child of the grid, it's a grid item, and is a parent for the flex container, the Flexbox, the flex formatting context. So it's a flex container at the same time. So overall, the concept, you have to really kind of know what is a container, what does it do, what are the items, what does it do, how is it that we nest them together. So here's an example, a diagram of an example, a very common layout that we've been doing for many years. We've been trying to do this kind of layout with Flexbox and we've been struggling. This layout, the overall layout of the layout of the cards themselves is much better served by grid. So let's go ahead and make the overall group of cards a grid container, and we'll make each one of those cards be a grid item and lay them out with grid. And then each card is in fact a container itself. And we're going to have content inside in that container where that content are a bunch of items. And in this case, with this layout, we could easily use Flexbox. So here's a running example that I've put together. You can check this out online, of that exact kind of layout, where the content inside the cards is laid out with Flexbox, the cards themselves are laid out with grid. There's some other terminology I want to breeze past you so that you can see it. We've got a grid container, grid items, grid cells, and grid areas. So any 1x1 unit on the grid is called a grid cell. You can also define areas. So an area might be multiple cells. Here you can see an area might be wide, it might be tall. An area can be one cell. It doesn't have to be bigger than one cell. It could be square. But no matter what, every single area is some sort of a rectangle. There are no L-shaped areas. It's not possible. You could define sort of a rectangle up here, or you could define another rectangle over here, and then you could sort of work out your code that way. But there's no way to define, at least not in grid level 1. There's no such thing as an L-shaped area. All the areas are some sort of a rectangular shape made up of one or more cells. We also have rows and columns. This is for a horizontal writing mode, which you get by default if you don't define a writing mode. For those of us who are laying out English text, for example, this is the most common writing mode that we're used to. But you can lay out text in a vertical writing mode. For example, Japanese or Chinese or Korean. If you want to, you can lay that out in a vertical writing mode. And if you use grid in a vertical writing mode, then it switches the rows and the columns. And the columns are horizontal and the rows are vertical. You can also call rows and columns tracks. It's a nice generic word. It gets used in a lot of tutorials, especially to just talk about defining your tracks. It doesn't really matter whether it's a row or a column. All the track definitions, all of the code that has to do with how tracks get defined is the same no matter which way it is. There's also lines, right? So a bunch of row lines, a bunch of column lines. There are grid gaps. If you don't define a grid gap, then your gap is basically set to 0. Your line is just 0 pixels tall. But if you define a gap, you can make your gap be a certain amount of space, and you can create space between items in your layout very, very easily. You cannot put content in a grid gap. If you want to put content in a grid gap, then really you shouldn't have a grid gap. What you should do is make a track, and then make a skinny track, and make a bigger track, and make a skinny track, and make a bigger track. And then you can put content in those skinny tracks. Grid gaps are, by definition, void of all content. Every line is also numbered, and as you write code, you're going to frequently target those numbers, and you're going to say, I want you to go from line 3 to line 5, and that's going to tell it to run from 3 to 5. One of the big differences, though, if you are a person who's used a tool like Bootstrap or Foundation or any other of the many, many layout frameworks that are out there, the float-based layout frameworks, most of those frameworks use numbers, but the numbers are the number for the track. So you might say, I want this to run from 3 to 5, and that's going to make it run like column 3, column 4, column 5, which is 3 columns wide. That's not how CSS Grid works. So you want to let go of those ideas, purge that from your mind, and instead, if you say, I want this to run from 3 to 5, it's going to run from line 3 to line 5, which bridges 2 columns. A bit tricky to switch, but once we switch, we'll never remember that it used to be a different way. This actually feels very natural and makes a lot of sense. There are also negative numbers in the universe of grid. They do not work like a Cartesian geometry graph. So it's not like you have line 0 and then the positive numbers go this direction and the negative numbers go that direction. It's not like that at all. Basically, there's an explicit grid. When you define an explicit grid, it's going to take the very last number and not label that -1 and then work its way backwards. So for example, in this diagram, if we just assume that this entire grid that's been defined here is an explicit grid, then you can see the numbers across the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and across the bottom, -1, 2, 3, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6, to kind of give you 2 different ways to target lines. Whichever one is more convenient, whichever one gets the job done. There is this concept of explicit and implicit. It's used a lot in grid. Basically, anytime you're talking about something explicit, it means that you have defined it. You define the rows, you define the columns, and that creates an explicit grid. There are times when you don't define rows, or you don't define columns, or maybe you define the columns but you don't say anything about the rows, and the browser creates the rows automatically. Whenever the browser is creating something automatically for you, it's an implicit context, so that you end up with an implicit grid or implicit rows, implicit columns, where the grid starts making them because it thinks you need them, but you didn't define them explicitly. It's also important to understand the difference between the grid in CSS and the content or the interface elements, the things that are in the HTML that get placed onto the grid. Sometimes this confuses people. Those content elements or those interface elements, the things, whether it's a form or a paragraph or a headline or a button or a divs that have things inside of them, maybe things that JavaScript handles, those things exist in HTML. Of course, you can style them with any other CSS. If you want to have a headline with a big thick line across the bottom of it, great. It's a headline, you put a big thick line on it with CSS, just like we've always done. And then you can take that content, that H1, that element, and place it on the grid someplace. The grid itself exists in CSS only. It can't be styled, at least not using the grid level 1 specification. There isn't a way to say, oh, okay, so I put my headline here and I put my paragraphs here, but I would really like to have a big long line all the way down the side of the page. I'd like to have a big line all the way across. There's no way to sort of have a line all by itself or a background color. You might say, oh, well, I've got my headline here and my content here, my text here, but I'd actually like to have a big orange stripe on the side of the page. There's no way to make a background color on the empty cells, on the grid cells. I'd like to see that at grid level 2. I think that could be very, very useful. I'm working with the CSS working group to see if we can get something like that. Doesn't exist yet. So what you need to do instead is have an element and place that element and then put the styling on that element. So I like to use B elements because they're not really being used for anything else. It's kind of obvious that the B isn't really anything. I prefer that to using an empty div, for example. But you can take an empty B element and place it into a track and fill up a whole area and then make that orange, or place it across your entire grid and put a black thick line on it. That's what we're going to need to do for now. So I hope those basics help you. CSS Grid, there's a lot to learn.
Okay, so
But those are some of the overall concepts, a lot of the
So from that video, you can see, and probably working with grid as well, that grid is quite a bit different than what we've worked with before. So we got to get used to the idea of tracks, the idea of working with rows and columns, and the different, the whole explicit versus implicit grid. So there's a bit of a learning curve, but you can also see how powerful it is. So before we get to the basics, we're going to go through a grid exercise together. I think this would be a good time to pause, take a break. We will come back at 2:05, and then we're going to work through some code and try out this grid stuff.